Hi, everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. I have a special guest with us tonight, a local writer and journalist, and that's Kirsten Han. She's written a really fantastic book, which I just had the pleasure of reading. So here it is, The Singapore I Recognize, Essays on Home, Community, and Hope. So, Kirsten, thanks so much for being on our show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Right, no worries. Just before I start, right, I have a really funny question for you because I have an autograph copy and I'm really intrigued with this cat picture. Is this something you drew or
No,
yeah,
it's a stamp. It's a stamp. I bought it in a stationery shop. Um, I on and off have these like stationery phases where I get really into things. So at one point I was really into like notebooks, now I was really into stickers, and then there was this short phase where I was really into stamps. And I bought these cat stamps at a stationery shop in KL. And then I haven't used them in like a really long time. So when Ethos was saying that I had to sign books, I just decided to bring them.
right. I thought it's really cute. And I guess maybe it's like a good opening to anyone reading your book, which is, how deep down you're just a person who still enjoys having cats and
Yes.
yeah, like the kind of person you are. So anyway, first let me, give a standard introduction to who you are. So in case there's anyone who's watching this and who just doesn't know who Kirsten is, so Kirsten Han is a journalist and activist from Singapore. She has been the managing editor of Mekong Review, which is a quarterly Asia-focused literary magazine since the end of 2022. She runs two newsletters, We the Citizens and Altering States, in which she writes about Singapore politics, human rights, civil society, and drug policy. And you can find these newsletters at wethecitizens.net. Now, her byline has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, Foreign Policy, and more. She received an honorary mention in 2018 from the World Justice Project's Anthony Lewis Prize for Exceptional Rule of Law Journalism, and a Human Rights Press Award in 2019 for her commentaries on fake news and freedom of expression. Kirsten's also a member of the Transformative Justice Collective, where she works towards the abolition of the death penalty and an end to Singapore's war on drugs. Last but not least, and that goes back to what I just said just now about cats, Kirsten is mother to three cats and anywhere between 5 to 15 K-pop plushies. Maybe I should check in. How many do you have right now?
Um, I definitely okay. So I probably do have about 15 like actual ones in my house, but that's not to say I have not ordered more. They just haven't arrived yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, it's nice to see this aspects of who you are, right? I think it helps people to connect that deep down you're just a girl who also likes cats, K-pop, K-dramas, and I may even get into that a little bit, maybe in our
Yes.
conversation. So anyway, before I start asking you questions, right, Kirsten, so I just want to say a little bit first about, the context of our conversation. So look, I find it unfathomable if there's any Singaporean out there who doesn't know who you are, but it's entirely possible, that the people who don't know who you are, they don't understand the nature of the work that you do, right? All they've heard from you is maybe from the mainstream press, government officials, or whatever politicians have commented about you. And so that's why I think it's really great you've written this book. It's deeply personal and engaging. It helps not so much even for someone like me, but I think in the eyes of other people, I think, your book helps to get people to understand, who you are, the nature of the work that you do, activism, human rights issues. And so, I find it really good that your book has been buttressed with very positive blurbs from, notable academics like Teo Yu Yen, who called it informative, nuanced, deeply humane. We had also Professor Kenneth Paul Tan on our show, and he also gave a positive blurb for your book. And lastly, there's Sharon George, who says, one day Kirsten's conscientious contributions will be lauded. Until then, she is the eye that too few people in Singapore recognize. The country is blind for it. So those are really, really powerful words. And so I hope anyway with our conversation, we will work towards demystifying, who you are, the challenges that you face in your work, and just people being able to see you as a concerned Singaporean, who's vocal, who just has a different perspective and some critical analysis about us, as a people and society. And I think just like the way Singapore as a country, right, can be viewed as either a technocratic, capitalist, utopian paradise, or a Disneyland masquerading dystopia, that subjugates and exploits her people cunningly in that very binary sense. I think Singaporeans also look at you somewhat in that binary lens as well, right? They can see you as a bleeding heart liberal or lefty who just wants to veer Singapore towards a more humanistic direction. Alternatively, you are the devil incarnate, communist card carrying, foreign funded insurgent. You want to overthrow the ruling elite. You want everyone to burn the LKY memorabilia and install Mahathir in place. So it goes without saying, of course, by virtue of me, having you here, what perspective I clearly adopt. And just to set the context, right, of how I wish to converse with you. So, to the viewers as well, right, I don't want to act like as I'm some impartial interviewer, like I'm some news anchor who's just simply interviewing you about the process of writing a book. I think, for me as a Singaporean who's also deeply concerned with social issues, justice, fairness, equality, those things we pledge in our national pledge, I would prefer to engage in more personal aspects, right? Your thoughts, values, and beliefs that arises from your writings. And I hope that we can have a candid conversation on that in the hopes that, it will resonate better and deeper with viewers. And, the other reason for also trying to converse like this is that I just don't see a point, and there's nothing really interesting to run through all the different facts. Not that facts aren't important, but, just the different points of like what this politician said, what you said, as if we're trying to adjudicate some kind of objective truth in a spotlight setting. I think that is a problematic mindset in itself in Singapore, the way we have discourse in Singapore. It doesn't help us think critically, broadly about many social issues. And it doesn't really help people see that there can be many legitimate perspectives one can have on social political issues because we all come in with incomplete knowledge, facts, lived experiences, values, beliefs, and priorities. So, and of course, lastly, I don't really want to be POFMA. So in case some statements taken out of context or is misinterpreted wrongly. And lastly, I just want to say, I also feel like when it comes to public discourse in Singapore, sometimes we may find ourselves disagreeing with each other. And what I like to model for people, who may disagree with you vehemently on your vision for Singapore is we can have civil conversations, we can even have combative ones, but yet we can attempt to understand that, the reasons why we have these different perspectives, and we don't have to banish critics or ascribe to them nefarious, means and label them as traitors. I think we can do better than that as a country. So, okay, that's great. Enough of me talking. So we have a kind of standard opening question, Kirsten, on our show. So I'd like to ask you, when was the first time you realized something was not right with the world or a spell was broken for you?
I think, I think it was probably a few like different things, right? So I remember quite clearly being in New Zealand. So I lived in New Zealand when I was about 17 to 2021 doing my undergrad, and before then I had this very comfortable life in Singapore where you're just kind of happy to imbibe whatever's told to you in school and not really think that much about it. So I was pretty happy, with the status quo. Everything was going pretty well. I obviously came from a comfortable enough family that I could even be in New Zealand doing my undergrad in the first place, right? So I hadn't really thought about like Singapore politics or democracy or political rights. I hadn't thought about any of that. But I remember sitting in my student flat and kind of surfing the net. I don't really remember how I came across it, but I found the blog that used to be run by Martin C. And he wrote about Operation Spectrum. And that to me, I can't remember that feeling that I had that was like very striking, like that doesn't seem right. Like this whole idea that people could be detained without trial. And, the idea that this was something that happened in Singapore was really kind of striking to me. Like, it was the sort of thing where like, you might have heard of it before, but as a Singaporean, I heard about it as things that happen in other countries, where there's not so much rule of law or like where there's corruption or where there's, all sorts of other problems. But Singapore doesn't have these problems, right? And that was something that I was very comfortable assuming for a very, very long time. And so I remember that moment of finding out and thinking like, that's really bad. That's like, you can't do that to people. That's really bad and seems really unjustified. But I think that in and of itself was not enough to like completely shake the worldview that I had, right? But then I think then that was already kind of the basis of realizing that, that there are whole aspects of Singapore that I don't understand and I don't know, I've not experienced. And it doesn't mean that they are not there. Like just because I've not experienced it, it doesn't mean that they're not there. And so with that basis, then later coming back to Singapore and getting more involved and finding out about, the death penalty, finding out who's on death row, meeting the families, then it kind of increasingly chipped away at a lot of assumptions that I had.
Yeah, I think people who haven't read your book might be intrigued to find out that you stated that you when you were overseas you actually used to defend Singapore, that you were one of those patriotic Singaporeans who would say, oh, no country hasn't done anything wrong, and thought that essentially everything that we do in Singapore, it's not that it's flawless, but there's a rhyme and reason behind it, and that it sort of like has a certain kind of mentality or rationality that isn't that's not easy to critique, basically. And
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
It's not like I thought that Singapore was super perfect, right? Because the whole reason why I wanted to study abroad was because I felt like being a student in Singapore was very stressful and quite stifling. And so I really wanted to have this experience of being abroad. So like it wasn't like I thought Singapore was like everything was perfect, but I think there was a lot of kind of faith that like for all the imperfections, it's the efficiency, the rule of law. Singapore doesn't do anything that's like below the belt sort of thing, right? So it was a very sort of kind of depoliticized notion of like, oh, life is stressful, but that's just because life is like that. Then in other places, life is a bit different. So I want to go and try. Yeah. So yeah, I think that then later developed into a more kind of informed view of why things are the way they are.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you because I actually resonate with that account, because I also felt like when I went overseas, in my case it's Australia, to study, that's where I also get kind of like a political awakening, very similar to what you're describing. And in that sense, I thought a lot about the idea that Singaporeans, particularly the middle class and above, they're pretty well traveled. You could maybe even say that they're pretty well informed in that, or well educated in that formal sense, right? But looking at both our experiences, I want to ask you, what do you think is very distinctive or helpful to the overseas experience that actually helps to broaden a person's mindset?
I don't necessarily think that I had the political awakening overseas. Like I definitely like started learning a little bit overseas, but then I would still kind of date like actual political awakening to coming back from overseas. But I think what was really useful and helpful to have had that space. So, after I survived school and O levels and everything, I actually found university in New Zealand very easy. Not that the topics were not challenging, right? But like the workload was easy, right? So like I was that nerd kid in class who finished all my assignments 2 weeks before deadline. And everybody was like, oh my God, why do you work so hard? But to me, I was like, no, but this is holiday mode. Like I haven't even started working hard yet. Like, have you not seen the homework that I get when I was in school in Singapore? Then like this amount of assignment is like perfectly fine. But I think having that space, right, not being so stressed and tied down all the time, having teachers who were very open and like not very hierarchical in the way that they wanted to engage with you, and like teachers who treated you like you're an adult, right? So like even if for whatever reason, say you have to miss class that day, they're not chasing you for MC because they think you're pretending to be sick, right? They're just like, well, you're an adult, so if you skip class, then you bear the consequences, and that is your choice. And like I think that for me was actually very good for learning, because it wasn't about spoon feeding, right? But it was about you make your choices and you're accountable for your own choice, right? Nobody is here to like watch out for you and send you to school and make sure you do your homework and all that sort of things. So I think having that space was really quite important to me.
Yeah, I definitely do think that little anecdotal experience, it does say a lot about the differences between our educational system and other countries. And I definitely want to touch on that a little bit more later in our conversation, because we're definitely going to talk about the depoliticization of our education system, right? But let me first, go to the very first, chapter of your book, right, where you make a point about, I should put it this way. You started the book with a quote, right, from Asok Kumar Miripuri, and that is a person who's Singapore's ambassador to the United States. He was at the time rebutting your piece for the New York Times in 2018, saying that I cannot recognize the country Ms. Han describes, this idea of Singapore as a authoritarian paradise where critics of the government are squished and drug traffickers are hanged. And he claims that we, quote unquote, debate issues vigorously online and off. So I do feel like in your writing, you were actually quite sympathetic in some sense, because you thought he could be just being protective for Singapore's international image. He's just doing his job. But nevertheless, we can understand, right? Like, this is not just simply a rebuttal of non-recognition, but a recognition that, some Singaporeans want to deny. In fact, to me, all three statements, that critics are squashed, drug traffickers are hung, and there's some level of vigorous debate online, offline. I mean, they all can be factually true, but I think what's the issue at hand is that he sees obviously a different kind of Singapore. So my question to you is, what kind of Singapore do you think critics such as him, what do they see, and what do you feel is wrong or missing in their perception of the country?
I mean, I think, yeah, we're all informed by our own background and experiences, right? So like our understanding of what Singapore is very informed by what we have experienced. So, and I know this from my own experience, right? So before, when I was a teenager, when my whole experience of Singapore was, comfortable nuclear family and comfortable 5-room HDB flat, and everybody I knew was either, that same level of middle class, if not doing better, then at that time, it was very easy to accept that Singapore has the right policies, that Singapore has no homeless people. I mean, I've never seen one at that time, right? At that point in my life. So when teachers say there's no homelessness in Singapore, I'm like, correct, never seen a homeless person. So clearly does not exist. So then it's very easy to then form that view that like these things are working. And also very tempting to, when you come across hints that things are not working, to try to rationalize it some way, right? So because if you accept that it's bad and it's not working, then it starts to feel like there's some sort of responsibility to do something about it, or it kind of tarnishes the image that you have when it's there. So, definitely like, turns out there are homeless people, then, maybe they don't work hard enough. Maybe they're not saving enough money. Like, it can't be our system's fault because our system works so well. It must be their fault. So I think there is that sort of tendency to rationalize things that way so as to remain comfortable. Because otherwise you have to acknowledge that it doesn't work and things need to change. And maybe in the change, it might even require you to give up some of your privilege, right? So I think, I can't speak for other people of what they see, but I have like observed this among some people before, right? That it's just so much easier to rationalize and not examine. And if you are lucky enough to come from a background that allows you to kind of be insulated from a lot of these issues, then it's just very comfortable to stay there.
Yeah, definitely. I think, what you're describing is essentially the kind of social and class stratifications that, exist in a place like Singapore, where you do have these bubbles. And even these bubbles, they can take in different forms as well. I mean, just to give something anecdotal, like I have a friend who works as a school counselor. So when she was in public schools, she obviously had access and interacted with people of all different social classes, right? And she can really see this widespread of different classes, social groups, privileges, and stuff like that. Then when she transferred to an international school, she felt she was in a bubble. It's like all these issues just disappeared, and she was like, wow, she could even see that the expats who live in these communities, they also were very insulated. And it sort of like woke her up to think that, yeah, in Singapore, one can choose to live a life very insulated from many other things that are happening at the same time. And as you said, if you could choose to live that way and just choose not to do anything about it. But I guess as Singaporeans, we do want to see some kind of change in our society.
I think it's definitely like we are a very stratified society in ways that we don't necessarily always reflect on. So, one very common joke is that everybody in Singapore knows everyone, right? And like my husband is not from Singapore, so when he first moved to Singapore, one thing he would say was 6 degrees of separation is at least 4 degrees too many for Singapore. Because like you would just go somewhere and then you're like, hey, I know that person. Or like you meet like a random stranger and turns out you went to the same school as somebody, and like, and so like that's true. But at the same time, like I was talking about this to a friend before, and that friend pointed out like that's true, but only within your set. It's almost like some sort of Victorian society where you only know people in your set. And like so, like I might walk on the street and see a lot of people, but they're the same people who like went to university or went to certain schools. It's much more rare to then suddenly say like, oh, um, from a very elite school background, then like, oh yeah, I have a lot of friends who live in public rental flats. Like that's not the case. And then when you meet people who live in public rental flats, they kind of know each other as well. But we all know each other within our sort of strata. And I think that also then creates this very different layered experiences of Singapore that we're not necessarily realizing that other people have.
Yeah. So the other thing I want to talk about regarding your book, right, is that basically, your book is, I guess, maybe I haven't been quite well read on local literature, but I feel like it's one of the few books out there that really have an insider perspective on what it is to be an activist locally. And as you mentioned, it comes with a lot of complexities, contradictions, because as you wrote, on the outside, Singapore doesn't necessarily look like an authoritarian state, especially to many outsiders. You obviously acutely aware that in other countries, other activists can get kidnapped, assassinated, arbitrarily jailed. So obviously the level of danger here is very different. It's not that it isn't there, but it's just different. And as you correctly pointed out, I think every Singaporean agrees with this, right? There is a culture of fear in talking about politics, which in turn produces a depoliticized culture. But, what I was thinking of trying to ask you to do is, for those people who essentially have a very negative view about activism, right? They just don't see the point of it, right? Can you, and even though this is very too obvious a question for you, but can you maybe say what you think the role in activists is? What kind of value add? And I hate that term; it's very technocratic, but maybe just the language that people need to hear. What value add does an activist have towards societal goodness, well-being, and all that?
Yeah, I think it's a huge kind of thing that like you might not necessarily notice it in your day-to-day life, and you might not necessarily feel like you need it in your day-to-day life. But if it's not there as it has been in Singapore, and if it's not there for a long time, it actually really makes an impact, right? And it's not just like activism is only about very liberal woke, issues, whatever, but it can really impact people's lives as well, right? Like activism can be about labor protections, which then is very directly about your bread and butter. It can be about your healthcare or your GST or whatever. And it all intersects, right? So even when somebody is engaging in activism for, say, migrant workers' rights, then sometimes they are criticized for, oh, why are you doing so many things to help foreigners and not local Singaporeans? But actually, if migrant labor rights improved, that would also have an effect on Singaporean workers, because Singaporean workers are currently, having their wages suppressed and things like that because there's so much cheap migrant labor to exploit. So it's all kind of connected. And I think, it's definitely something that people might not immediately feel that they need, but it really makes a difference if it isn't there. And I think, it also has that, so like the direct value of advocating for these issues and bringing about change, because in a lot of these cases, people in power, and like not just the PAP, right, but we see everywhere in the world, people in power do not seed things without demand. And so to have that demand is important, but I think also there's an indirect value in signaling to society that we as citizens have power and have voice. And I think that really makes a difference. Like, there's a real like psychological difference between, oh, my country is very shiny, but I don't have a say in any of it. And then a different situation where, oh, I can see that there are problems, but I feel like I can do something about that. And I think that's a huge difference, right? I think that's the difference between staying at a resort and living in your own home.
Yeah, and to me, I think part of the problem we have here, right, is that we're such a young nation. It's very hard to witness in real time some kind of victory that has been won just through activism. I mean, I can think of a really small example. It'd be something like stop shark fin eating, but it was something. There was also like this one particular protest, which is some years ago. It was something to do with the dolphins that were being held at Resorts World. And I remember a lot of normal everyday Singaporeans and environmentalists were against that, and it did work. So, these are very small victories, but, maybe the biggest one we should talk about actually is Pink Dot, right? The repeal of 377A. I mean, that's something that's clearly happened in our lifetime. And it's clearly through the kind of pressure, the kind of normalization with LGBTQ culture, and to see that, these people very much belong to our society. So I think that's kind of like what's lacking in Singapore. Like we don't see the kind of victories. And to me, anyway, I feel like, we just need to look at overseas examples where it's so powerful what activism can do and how we can just transform society to something better.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also because we have not been allowed to see historically the activists who have really put in a lot of the work. I mean, in the very earliest days, the PAP themselves were activists who were pushing, right? They were an opposition party, they were a new party, they were pushing, anti-colonial activism. And that's all very key, right? And then also the trade unions and everything. And there was so much work going on. There was so much organizing, right? It was very much, when I learn about them, it's very much like, oh, it's not that Singaporeans don't know how to organize. And it's not that Singaporeans don't know how to be activists, or that we are just somehow by nature so passive that we don't know how to, mobilize. We clearly did. And like even in a very short history, we clearly did, and we clearly had these people, but that was very deliberately suppressed. And I think that's part of it, right? Because when you then don't hear the stories happening in Singapore, then it's very easy to come to a conclusion that it's not possible.
Yeah, and I think
models, then it's very easy to just think, oh, it can't be done. So I think that's part of it as well.
Yeah, I think this goes into, on our channel, sometimes we talk about philosophy and the idea about whether is there a essential trait that people have, right? And this idea that Singaporeans are essentially passive, docile, submissive, that's just not, something that you find in physical science, right? It's not that Singaporeans are born that way. It's just something that's due to cultural conditioning, right?
Even if you just look at some of the things that we engage in, it's clearly not true, right? Like some Singaporeans are like really disproportionately worked up about their condo committees, so they might not engage in national politics, but they are very political when it comes to their condo committees, or, get very vocal and upset about, certain brands, and like backlash against corporate and company. And yeah, and a lot of things, right? So like actually Singaporeans are not really very passive. It's just that we are not, we can now have a culture where like this sort of action is not necessarily seen in the political arena.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add that, one thing I really appreciate from your book is that you affirm these two lone climate strikers, Wong Jae-min and Nguyen Minh, right? They were just two young adults simply holding up signs, protesting outside the offices of, fossil fuel companies. And, I wish their names were much more public. I wish we had paid them more acknowledgement and recognition. Obviously, on my channel, I talk a lot about, the climate crisis and how we need to pay more attention to that. And, just to also somewhat answer the question that I just gave you, right, about the value of activism. So I just wanted to share this anecdote and get your response as well. So I once had a debate with a friend of mine because she had posted up a meme where there was Greta Thunberg and this other young boy scientist. And the meme was trying to insinuate that Greta Thunberg is basically like a rebel rouser. She doesn't do anything with value. Whereas the young boy scientist, he's doing something to contribute to environmentalism, right? So it's like a technocratic fix. Like this young boy scientist could do that, whereas Greta Thunberg cannot provide that, right? And I engaged in a debate. I mean, she's a friend, so it's friendly, but I was trying to make her see that this is such a negative way of appraising activism, of seeing that Greta Thunberg, for all the emotions and the stuff that you're not particularly happy about, she delivers a very powerful message, and she is that kind of like messenger, right, to encourage people to transform their social values, to take environmentalism much more seriously and stuff like that. And it's been some years since that discussion I had with my friend, and I was very glad to see some recent research articles actually saying that the Norwegian youths, they have become much more empowered, and they take environmental issues much more seriously due to what they call the Greta Thunberg effect. And that's kind of like where I see the contribution of activism comes from, right? The problem is just people don't quite get it. Like, many of the worst problems, including especially environmental issues, will not be solved by technocratic fixes, but really require some kind of transformation of social values. And you can't do that just through technology.
And they're not as binary as that, right? So like, that boy scientist is doing fantastic work, but firstly, not all of us can be, prodigy scientists. Not all of us have that aptitude, but you still need to let people be empowered to do something, right? So there's that. But also that like the research funding that goes to boy scientists being able to do their work is also political, right? Like how corporations that donate money or governments that allocate money, they are still very politically kind of informed as well. And so if you don't have, any sort of public pressure to put the climate crisis on the agenda, there might be no funding for climate action research, so it actually, they are not binary. It's not like you either do this or you do that, right? But they can actually work together. So like the activism puts it on the agenda so that it gets allocated funding, and then the research funding is providing information that funnels into the activism, and it all kind of goes together.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think it's, like you said, because it's not binary, you can support both strands of solutions, right? And as you said, if you have a much more critical political lens, you can really see where the corporation want to put their funding to. And it's not usually for things that are, to their detriment, or, it's always to projects that are clearly geared towards more profit for them. So it's probably going to be some form of greenwashing kind of effort as well. So, we've definitely been hovering around this idea about depoliticization. And, you use that to describe our educational system, right? So essentially, you were trying to say that our educational system doesn't take into account critical treatments of historical events such as Operation Spectrum. It doesn't want to acknowledge undesirable social issues such as homelessness, LGBTQ rights, abuse, exploitation of migrant workers. And I also enjoyed the part where you shared some experiences of you talking to students in democracy classrooms, and you get dumbfounded, right? Like from responses that they claim government can do no wrong. And so, as you put it, which I think most people need to understand, is that, in our educational system, it's just that many kinds of politics narratives are excluded. And so what's left is this kind of hegemonic thinking that becomes defined as common sense or truth. But, I do think a lot about like how in principle, some parents, some people would argue, hey, it's a public educational system. As a general principle, you don't want to make it a site for political education. And so schools should just not be that, should be kept insulated from that. And, all you just want to do is just make sure students are prepared for, the adult working life. So what I want to ask you is, how would you persuade these people, right, that not only is it possible, I mean, given that you've observed this in other countries, but there is, like I said, this kind of benefit that goes beyond scoring A grades and getting a high-paying job.
There's something that people kind of conflate or mix up, where like when we talk about political, there are different types of political, right? There's like the party politics, like partisan politics, political, which is like that sort of like P politics, where it's about political parties that you support or don't support. But then there's also the political, which is just the idea that politics is how societies and like large numbers of people come together to make decisions about, you know, how we want to use our resources, where we want to put our focus, how we want to run our society. And so in that way, that sort of small p politics is just kind of everywhere, right? So I think it's interesting in that Singapore's education system is very depoliticized, but in a political way, where like what we have depoliticized is the form of thinking about politics and recognizing that there are political and systemic and structural issues involved, right? Like that the climate crisis is also about exploitation, and it's also about questioning policies of economic growth, and it's also about questioning, you know, policies of, you know, building and development, like what does development mean, so all these are political questions, right? But you don't necessarily have to like support or promote a particular political party to discuss it. It's concepts and it's discussion. And then but what we so we don't do that in school so much, right? Students are not allowed to criticize policy, or not encouraged to criticize policy, are not really often encouraged to see things as structural. So like racism must be talked about as, oh, be nicer to your neighbor, or like on Racial Harmony Day, we will exchange food, and you know, all these very like personal things, but we don't talk about like institutionalized racism. But then at the same time, it is also political in that if you're in school, you can say anything nice about the PAP that you want, right? You can say that, oh, you know, our government ministers, our PAP ministers are so good that like, you know, they solve problems that other countries' governments cannot solve. And you can say all of that, and that's encouraged. But if you want to like start talking about, you know, actually maybe opposition parties are better than PAP, then like sometimes that's not seen as something that can be talked about. So we've kind of had this system where the thinking is very depoliticized, but it's still very political in the sense that one party is benefiting massively from this, right? And in a way also promotes that party. You know, even in little things like how come when kids get school awards, the PAP grassroots advisor can go. And even if you live in an opposition world, it's not as easy to have the opposition MP go. And that's seen as, oh, suddenly that's political and sensitive and the school doesn't want to go there. But if it's a PAP, that's never a problem, right? So it's complicated in that it's like depoliticized, but also extremely political. And I think I can see, obviously, like, I also agree, right, that schools should not be capital P political, in that we are not saying that we will one day have schools that are like WP schools and PAP schools and SDP schools, right? That's not what we're saying. Schools should be open spaces for students to consider their principles and values, and then whoever they want to choose to support in an election is their own business. But schools should be able to educate students about how politics works, not who to support, but how it works, and how to evaluate parties, and how to think about the issues that affect us. And I think that's also so much part of adult life, right? And that's one thing I felt like as an adult coming out and then having to like crash course learn all these things by myself. I'm like, actually being able to evaluate critically, and to question authority and to, you know, make these decisions for myself are so much more relevant to my adult life than like whatever advanced mathematics that I have slogged through throughout my secondary school years, which I now cannot remember and never use. But like, you know, actually being able to engage politically is a very big part of adult life that I felt very unprepared for coming out of school in Singapore.
Yeah, I do wonder sometimes. I mean, I'm, so far advanced in age that I don't even know what students study nowadays. And I had a chance to look at my niece and nephew like school textbook, and I was quite like impressed with the level of depth and detail, but not in that critical sense, just the amount of information they had to absorb, the amount of things they had to learn from a history textbook or whatever. But it's not like what you say, it's not like it's done in a way that's intelligent or critical. It's just let me give you a whole smash full of information, and you just try your best to remember as much of it as you can, right? That kind of rote learning kind of paradigm. And what I want to ask you is, given your engagement with politics, activism, all that, do you see, at least, since sometimes the education system cannot fulfill the hunger, right, for critical research or analysis, do you see younger people coming out to look for alternative venues, right, to seek that kind of education?
Yeah, definitely. I see. I think it makes a huge difference, right? That like with the internet, there's so many sources that, for better or worse, there are so many sources at our fingertips. When I was in school and the teacher says, go home and read the news and cut out a newspaper article and bring to school, everybody is cutting from the Straits Times, right? There's no other way. And if it wasn't in the Straits Times, it's like it didn't happen. But now, there's so much, and like kids from a very young age are very adept at Google and whatever, and they can find all sorts of things. And so definitely I have met, young Singaporeans who have heard about Spectrum, who have heard about Coastal, who are interested in reading about these things and want to learn about these things at a way younger age than like many of my peers in my generation have, right? Like, 16-year-olds, 15-year-olds who know we have, and that's great, I think. But at the same time, when I talk to them about it, it's very like, it's not systematic, right? It's very luck of the draw. Like if you're naturally curious enough that you found out, or if you stumble upon, a book or a movie, or if your friends are the type of people who will talk about these things, then you will also have this political awakening. But you could just as easily be like among a circle of friends who don't talk about these things, and then you don't come across them. And it might not even occur to you that there's something out there for you to find. So that's definitely one conversation we had before at a democracy classroom that I did like pre-COVID, many years ago now, where we talked about like, it's great that there are more young people who are learning about these things by themselves, but it's still so much down to chance, but also to privilege, that like it kind of is still a little bit skewed. So like definitely at that time we were talking about this because we were like, so many of the young Singaporeans who are so politically engaged were all Yale NUS students. But like it's a privilege to be a Yale NUS student. Not everybody can, right? So, how can we make this more accessible and more empowering for a wider segment of people, rather than those who are lucky enough to have been to a school like Yale NUS, or lucky enough to be among friends who are, extremely well read and can share all these things. Like, what if you're a kid who's more comfortable in Malay than in English, and then your friends are not reading these things, and they're not sharing them on social media, then you don't come across it. Then yeah, so like I think, right now it's getting better, but it's still very kind of patchy.
No, I agree with that. I always felt like, as in touch as I am with a lot of the, alternative, well, I hate to use alternative news, but, the idea is that alternative journalism, and the, more left-leaning kind of sites or magazines and voices in Singapore, I do feel like, as you said, is coming from a very privileged circle. And it doesn't surprise me to hear that, a lot of the younger folks are coming from the Yale NUS cohort, right? And I've always felt like there's a need for people to be able to translate these materials to something that's more tangible, to whether it's a Malay, Tamil speaking, Chinese speaking audience. I've even thought about like, if I'm going to explain anti-capitalism, for example, how am I supposed to do that in Chinese? I wouldn't know how to do it because I'm pretty much like a potato, right? So yeah, so I always felt like there is that kind of need. Like I even think about like, if I want to tell my parents about, stuff like this, how do I do that if I just have the lexicon, the language, right? And this even speaks to like how some of us, in terms of our the disconnect from the older generation because of the way that we've been brought up, mainly English speaking, or yeah, I speak some Chinese, but we lost our dialect languages, we lost that kind of connection with our elders, right? It's so hard for us to communicate in that deeper sense as well. Yeah. So anyway, I want to now ask you, because this kind of ties in with everything we're talking about. So, if any PAP person is watching this right now, they may be horrified to hear, oh no, the young people are now starting to learn about this, alternative narratives and stuff like that, right? And getting involved in activism. And of course, to anyone who's part of the ruling elite, they of course would deem it very undesirable. And they probably would argue that, activism in itself, right, or, freedom of expression, right, is divisive, and, it would just lead to more chaos, disorder in society, right? And there may be even some legitimate concerns from some people that, I don't really want a very competitive political environment, right? Because they may see in other countries a lot more destructive aspects, right, of a more robust, democracy or political culture. So whether it's the US, the UK, or even Taiwan, right? And I just want to say, like, this is not necessarily like a emotional issue. I think academically, philosophically, there is something to be said about the idea that there is a certain paradox with democracy, and there is a book even called like that, the paradox of democracy, which makes the argument that there's some kind of inherent contradiction when you have increasing freedom of speech and media. There will be that freedom can become its greatest threat because it can facilitate much more demagoguery, distraction, and spectacle. So what I want to ask you is, do you have any ideas about how to assuage this kind of fears that, with increasing levels of democracy, that there will be more chaos? Or do you think it's just a necessary, price we paid so that, better, there's something, the more better means, regardless of the ends, the better ends regardless of the means?
I think we would need to also reevaluate what we mean by some of these values that we say are very important to us, right? So, for example, Singapore often talks about, oh, we are efficient. And then they're like, too much democracy, too much activism, too much people speaking out, it will get messy, and then things will be delayed and it will not be efficient. And really then we should question what we mean by efficient. And actually, very often when we say efficient, what we mean is fast. But fast is not efficient if you're going the wrong direction. So, if you did something fast and it turned out to be wrong and it created a bigger mess at the end, then that is not efficient. You just created a big problem for yourself more quickly, and whereas like it might be a messier process, but if there was more challenge, if there was more debate, if things were more negotiated and like things had to be revised more times because people were arguing about them, it might feel like the process is slower, but you might arrive at something that works better. So I kind of often feel like this whole it's better to not have so much democracy, then things will work better. This only works if like the people in charge are never wrong. And like it's very put all your eggs in one basket sort of situation, right? You're just betting that they will forever be benevolent and forever be very, very smart and forever have fantastic foresight and never get anything wrong. But then it really comes back to bite you if something is going wrong, but there's nothing you can do about it because you have been so shut out of any of the decision-making processes. Or if, the government starts to become less competent, or, then, but you don't have avenues to kind of have your voice heard and be part of the process, then it's also, that's not efficient, right? That's, in the long run, that's really kind of restricting yourself. So I think that there are these things that we have to question, and also to recognize that like there is no country in the world that has achieved democracy full stop, right? So democracy is not like a destination that you can arrive at and then just be like, yay, we came here, let's just stay here forever, right? It's an ongoing process and it's an exercise. So a book that I learned from quite a lot years ago was called Doing Democracy, and like to emphasize that it's an act of doing, right? Continuous doing. Nobody ever arrives at democracy. So with that in mind, right, just then to me, like when people point at things like, oh, you see what a mess the US is in. And I'm like, yeah, the US is a mess, but that doesn't mean that democracy is, unworkable. It just means that the US has made a mess of their own situation, and maybe they are not doing democracy particularly well right now, but it doesn't mean that this means that democracy is not an option for any of the rest of us. We could always do things differently. We can learn best practices and learn to avoid mistakes. And, Singapore is very different. We have a lot of different options. So we don't have to, it doesn't necessarily result in these things that we don't want to see. Like, the whole point of democracy is we would have a voice, so we would steer where it goes.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think also when it comes to defining democracy, like the way, as you mentioned, someone might point to the US and say, hey, look at that place, that's a model of democracy and how messed up it is. I mean, that's also actually to me that shows to me that this person has a very sophisticated understanding about US politics, because actually even in the US, there's very legitimate criticism about how, the political culture doesn't reflect democratic voices. Right? There are, just to mention one very simple example, there are already, research studies that show that when it comes to public policy making in the US, it all reflects the interests of the ultra-rich elites and not the voice of the people. That's why they don't have paid family leave and other very basic things that we actually have and we do enjoy. And we should actually remember that is also due to having some form of democracy. That's why you can have some of this, achievement, right? Yeah. So, in your somewhat connected to what we're talking about right now, right? In DSA, that you title "All the Things We Do Not Know," right? That is essentially a analysis, review of the way information, data, and knowledge gets guarded, right, in Singapore, and you detail meticulously, right, the experiences of people from NGOs, researchers, journalists, academics, the challenges of trying to obtain access to historical archives, government data, and statistics. So, essentially, it's not just a problem just for opposition people. It's really a problem for any regular person who wants to find out more about our country's issues or history better, right? Now, of course, we understand intuitively why the government will want to make things difficult. They're just trying to protect their own interests. They want to, shield themselves from possible criticisms. And of course, their rebuttal is sometimes the legitimate concern of protecting security interests and sensitive data, right? But as you put it, this kind of inaccessibility is not as profound as it is compared to other countries. So that's why we should try to advocate for a Freedom of Information Act. And I would like to ask you, even though you sort of wrote about it, of course you wrote about it in your book, but maybe explain it out in plain terms, right? What such an act would entail, how have other countries been able to do this, and yet at the same time balance the interests of people who want to, who need that information to conduct research, and yet the need for the country to also safeguard their own interests.
Yeah, so a Freedom of Information Act, I think at its very core, recognizes citizens' right to freedom of information. So that means that you have a right to know things about how your country is run, about how your public officials are conducting their business, and things like that, right? Like you have a right to be able to find out. And so the freedom of information, so right now what we have in Singapore is if you want to find something out and you can't already find it publicly, you can write into like the ministry or the stat board or whatever and ask them. And then it is up to them whether they want to reply to you or say yes or no, right? Whereas a freedom of information, I think that the whole principle of freedom of information is that it has to be reversed. So instead of you like having to plead with them for information, the burden is on them to justify why they cannot give it to you. So like instead of, right now the norm is they're not giving it to you unless there's some exception that they agree to let you have it. Whereas the Freedom of Information Act would at its core recognize the right so that when you write into the government, they should generally have an obligation to give you the information, except for certain reasons, which they have to clearly justify. So, if it's national security, if it's this or that, then they have to be able to explain why the information cannot be made public. So I think that's a very fundamental shift already, right? Like it recognizes that citizens are empowered to know, and that public officials are public servants. So like, if you're actually working for me, then I should have the right to know certain things about what you're doing and not up to you to decide what to tell me, right? Like there's no other situation in the world where the employee gets to decide what the boss knows about how they've been working. Yeah, so I think that's kind of at its core. And so Freedom of Information Acts have operated in different countries where people can write in. There are some cases where like you have to pay an administrative fee, and that administrative fee also like helps cover some of the costs, like somebody in civil service has to, spend their time replying to you and things like that. But it also can sometimes weed out people who are just like time wasting, right? Then, some people just want to kepo and ask for something, but if it costs a small admin fee, then maybe they're like, oh yeah, it's not worth it. So that can also work. And then there are like cases where, governments will then justify, why this information cannot go out, why this information needs to be redacted. So it doesn't mean that, just because there's a Freedom of Information Act, then like there's no such thing as national security anymore, then everything is out in the open. It can still be deliberated and considered.
Can you think of like some areas where, maybe not something where it's an activist related issue, something that's more mundane, where this kind of information will be really useful, whether it's about labor protections, whether it's about, inequality. Yeah. Can you think of some issues where you think it's where it'd be really worthwhile, right? Really potent to have this kind of access to information?
I mean, sometimes it comes out of like really random cases, right? Like I remember reading somewhere, and I don't remember where, I think it was in the UK or somewhere, where like somebody just wrote in and asked for like their local council's budget. And just from that, right, like discovered that there was some corruption in the
Right.
local. Because you just ask for something as simple as the budget, and then you're just like, our council is so small, how the hell do you eat so many biscuits in 1 year? And then it turns out they weren't spending on biscuits, right? Someone was stealing the money, So then, sometimes it's just as simple as that, right? Like it's a very random thing, then you suddenly discover. And I mean, Singapore is not new to it, right? We've had civil servants who were caught for corruption because of over declaring pineapple tarts, something very simple. And so I think, yeah, things like that. When like Parliament sits, sometimes they have these special committees that determine certain things. And right now, when we look at some of the minutes, it's not always very clear how these committees are chosen. Then, like, as a citizen, you're like, I want to know how come this person ends up on this committee. How did you decide that? Like, that's quite simple to ask. And, so just a lot of things that, people might want to understand better and not be at the government's mercy of whether the government wants to tell you, right? So like the one thing that kind of frustrated a lot of people, and which I opened a chapter with in my book, was Pritam Singh asking about the breakdown of jobs between citizens and PRs, right? And then Chan Chun Sing going, what is the point of the question? And it's like, no, like if it's our right to know, and if it's not a national security issue, then it's not up to you to ask what is the point of the question. Like sometimes we just want to know, and we're allowed to know, and what we do with this information is like that's all for us to analyze and determine, like, so it's not like, it just really kind of skews the relationship between citizens and their government. If every time we want to know something, the government is like, why do you want to know? I don't think you need to know this. And it's like, no, it's not for you to decide for me what I can or cannot know about my country.
So this seems like a really good issue, politically speaking, for Singaporeans to rally behind. And this is slightly speculative of a question, but do you know whether the opposition parties, are they interested in tackling this and pushing this as a form of like an issue to be voted on politically?
I mean, the Workers' Party has mentioned it quite a lot of times in Parliament. They've talked about it, they've brought it up, and the Workers' Party is in favor of Freedom of Information Act and have suggested it multiple times. If you go and like dig up the parliamentary records, they bring it up over and over again. They just don't have, I think, the political power to force it into a vote, right? There are too few of them. And also it's not like in and of itself, it doesn't crystallize to voters as an issue, right? Like it's never going to be an election issue in and of itself, because I think freedom of information is something that, people don't feel so directly, like they don't feel like it directly affects them, even though it would be a useful tool to have to work towards things that affect you. Like imagine if you could demand more information about HDB land pricing and start asking more questions about why property costs the way it costs in Singapore, that sort of thing. But Freedom of Information Act in and of itself seems like a very abstract thing to a lot of people. So I think it hasn't got enough sort of momentum yet.
Right. Yeah, maybe that requires some work on our part to try to rally behind this and make this relevant. So connected to this, right, is what I have for you as a question is kind of philosophical, because it's going to kind of pertain to what we think about human rationality, psychology, and just human goodness, right? So you're part of the Transformative Justice Collective, and what I've seen, implicit in the many calls from TJC, and there's one that I saw. Is today or is it yesterday? The one where
Yeah.
So where it's about trying to call for a public debate with Shanmugam, right? Minister Shanmugam. And it's one that I wholeheartedly endorse. I would rather that he debate you guys than some rich billionaire. And because it's really important, right? To have
It's us, but like it was the families that was asking to meet him.
Right.
So like, not just debate us, but actually, like if you are so pro death penalty, then you look in the eye of somebody whose brother, son, uncle that you have already hanged or are going to hang, and you look them in the eye and you tell them. They have a lot of things to say to the Singapore government, but they feel like nobody is interested in listening.
Right. So where my question is going is basically, it's kind of like me just kind of asking on a very personal level about your level of faith in human goodness, in maybe Singaporeans and their empathy, levels of empathy, right? Because I think implicit in this action, right, is the idea if people were simply given more access to more information, arguments, knowledge, they would change their views. And to me, it's not that I don't believe in that. It's just that I think it's a lot more complicated than that. So just to give an example, I've debated with a friend for 3 hours long about death penalty and stuff like that. And it's just, a simple lunch where the two of us were just talking, about it. And, what came through the conversation, it's not just that one conversation, but just through my way of seeing things from a philosophical lens, is that, it's not always about more information and more arguments that would change a person's mind. To me, sometimes it's about the moral appetite of the country. So maybe if we imagine hypothetically, even if you guys were able to have a lot more of your voices heard, in public media, mainstream press and all that, right? And maybe people do get the idea that death penalty doesn't work, but there may be just other values that Singaporeans, and I hate to have to put it this way, but maybe they value more things like, retributive punishment for the things that they don't want to see in society. So I know it's a difficult question, but just give me some sense of what your thoughts are.
I mean, the one thing that I learned a few years in was that you really can't change a person's mind. Like the act of changing a mind is a very personal one, that is a step that they have to take, right? And so like I had to learn that is not something I can control. Because if I kept feeling like I could make it happen, then it was just creating a lot of angst in my life. But like I had to accept that like I cannot make a person change their mind, but what I can do is, provide the information, provide the space, and provide opportunity for them to think about it, right? And maybe they don't change their minds right away, but as long as we can hold space for each other to kind of have these conversations, have these thoughts, and have this process, then maybe they will. And I think for me, that's like I've had to learn that like sometimes that is the best I can do. But I do have a lot of faith in Singaporeans actually to kind of talk and consider, because I don't think it's very rare. So not that it's never happened, but it's very rare. I've not met really many people who are just out for blood, right? Like actually the vast majority of people that I meet, even if they say they are pro-death penalty, are coming at it from a place of desiring safety, desiring security, desiring well-being. And so when we talk to them and we kind of, bring up how actually the death penalty does not contribute to well-being, then they are quite open to thinking about it, right? And they might not change their minds right away, but they're just kind of like, okay, I'll go back and think about this a little bit more. Like I was actually, surprised because TJC has teams that go door knocking. So they go door to door and they ask people, can I talk to you about the death penalty? And, I thought that they were actually going to get a very bad reaction. So I was not immediately in favor of this. I was like, oh no, we're going to send all these young volunteers to go and get screamed at, and people are going to call police on them. But actually, the response has been so much better than I expected. And a lot of people are quite open to talking about it. And you bring things up like, oh, what if there are wrongful executions? Do you know that most of the people on death row are like working class minorities? They are poor people. They don't have a lawyer when they're being questioned. They're alone with the police, and then people respond to that, right? So like there are very few people who are just like, no, I just want people to die. Like it's really very rare to come across that. And most of the time people are actually, what they are looking for is safety for themselves and their families and people around them. And they've just been told for a really long time that the death penalty delivers that. But once they kind of engage more in conversation, then they're not actually pro-death penalty people. They're just people who want to feel safe.
Right. I'm glad to hear that. That gives me a little bit more faith in our people. I should say anyway, just for anyone watching, we have done a interview with Kokila and Malai, and she's also a founder of Transformative Justice Collective. I'll leave the link in the description box so people can also watch that. They have a lot more extended interview, right, regarding the death penalty and stuff like that. So yeah, connected to what you just said about safety and all that. So while reading your book, right, that's where I first learned about the short film Last Days. So if anyone who hasn't watched this, just a short description, it's kind of like as Kirsten writes and describes it, it's a Black Mirror-esque short film produced by the Central Narcotics Bureau, to warn people about the use of drugs. And, after I read about it, I went to watch it. So just like you, I was in disbelief, but I was really laughing too because, the way it portrayed a very hypothetical future is so out of touch and so unrealistic, right? But I agree with what you essentially said. This is what you analyzed, that this is a very potent encapsulation of the worst moral panic buttons you can press in our country, and that's residing in our psyche, right? So, for example, some things I picked up were like, the idea that if there's this hypothetical act that that legalizes drugs, it's going to be the reason behind it is because we value individual rights and liberty. Like that was so emphasized. Funny enough, there was also this. Huh?
It was very snarky the way they
Yeah,
said
yeah,
it.
it was very snarky, yeah. And I also picked up something like it will lead to more economic growth, which I thought was very interesting. I'll talk about that later, right? And when they showed the drug user who was lying on his bed, he was daydreaming of being a champion athlete, which seems to me, whether unintentionally planned or not, right? It's almost like an undertone reference to athletes who maybe speak publicly about using drugs recreationally, right, to de-stress and to, in some indirect way, perform better in their sports. So I thought that was quite, quite interesting to see that. And the reason why I mentioned about the economic growth thing is because one can almost take this ad and recreate it, that instead of talking about drug legalization, you can substitute it with the opening of the casino, because the same moral panics were engendered back then, right? That having the casino will lead to more economic growth, but there were many Singaporeans who were against it because they were afraid it would lead to more vices and moral corruption. So yet we have the casinos here, they are alive and operating, right? So in any case, right, I felt like this entire thing is a case, perfect case study of propaganda, right?
Yeah.
And because it's such an inaccurate picture, right, of the drug decriminalization movement. But I need to ask you, because I think it's good to have you to clarify, right? For people who just don't understand what drug decriminalization is supposed to look like, what vision do you have of Singapore in terms of how we should treat the drug issue?
Yeah. So I mean, firstly, there are a lot of these terms, right? Decriminalization, legalization, and they all actually mean different things. And even within decriminalization, there are different ways that you can do it. So decriminalization just means it is not a criminal offense. So like if you get caught, you might get a fine, or you might be sent for like community service or some sort of counseling, but it's not a criminal offense in that sense, right? Like So it's something a little bit more, it would be a little bit more akin to like getting a parking ticket rather than, robbery. Like you get caught, there's a fine, it's a civil sort of punishment, but it's not a criminal record sort of thing. And legalization actually just means that it's fully legal. Like there wouldn't be any punishment. It's just completely allowed. Right. In the same way like alcohol is completely allowed. You can drink and it's completely allowed. So I think these are all different, and different countries have tried different ways of going about it. And so that's one thing. But I think the thing about that film and how it so actively like misinforms, that like its own logic doesn't hold within the film. Like that's what really struck me, right? Like, so in this film, it's talking about, oh, drugs are completely legalized, and then it shows that there's crime, there's robbery, then there are like junkies on the street corner, and then like the guy is like he stabbed a kid to steal his tablet so that he can have money to buy drugs. And like what I'm thinking is like, wait, if it's legalized, he doesn't need to do that. Like, why is there like thugs in a black market like that? If it's legalized, there is no black market. It's legal. Like it's black market because it's criminalized. So they have to sell it underground. And like if it's legalized, there is, you don't need to like go and like commit crime to like pay one gangster in the street corner to like smuggle you stuff, right? Like so actually in that way, that's why there's like a growing call for decriminalization in a lot of parts of the world, because they're also recognizing that once something is decriminalized, you can do a lot to regulate and keep people safe, right? You can set up regulations so that, if people get drugs, they are not, the chances of them getting it from very dodgy people who, might be selling them something that's poisonous or something that's much more potent than they signed up for, that gets reduced, right? So like people are also recognizing that there is a cost to the sort of punitive policies that we have, and that decriminalization allows you to do more things openly, like drug testing and health checks and counseling, and helps to kind of fight the stigma that leads to people who use drugs not coming forward for medical treatment or help. So I think, these are all things that we've not yet considered enough in Singapore, that, this whole idea, our current idea is that, oh, if we become lenient, then drugs will flood in and more people will be hurt. But we are not considering the hurt that is caused by the policies that we have. Like a lot of people who have been, come into conflict with the law and got caught into this system, like the prison system or the criminal punishment system because of drugs, their lives are made much more difficult because we are criminalizing drug use. Then, in some cases, the people that I've spoken to, I would even say that our policy destroyed their lives much more than drugs did. And so I think that's the part that we're not considering, right? We have spent a lot of money and a lot of resources in things that in many cases have made people's lives worse and not better.
Yeah, I just want to add to this that, like, speaking personally for myself, I mean, I'm seeing like how there is, like you said, right, there's this fear that people just simply have about, the idea that drugs will flood in, and that, you start to see all this signs of like social unrest and stuff like that just because of the drug issue. But, it's never that simple. There's always a lot more complicated factors that go into homelessness, that goes into people using drugs to begin with. And, we should actually do a better job of paying attention to the root causes, not just focus on, hey, someone's using a drug and that is the issue in and of itself. There's always something behind that. And that's also, the reason why if we take a much more sophisticated approach to this, then there are ways to then modify our current approach where it doesn't have to be so punitive and so retributive, right? So I think we cannot afford to not talk about POFMA, right? It's such a huge part of your book. And, you wrote a lot about the personal experiences you went through in terms of, you being invited to the select community on deliberate online falsehoods. There's sort of various experiences of you being POFMA, which you document extensively. Even not you by now, but even magazines like Jom, they've also been POFMA. So so I wanted to say first, right, and just to sort of clear the sort of principles behind it. That even before reading a book, when the government first talked about trying to introduce a legislation, to do something about fake news or the spread of falsehoods, I do think in principle a law like that, there's a certain right to exist, but purely for virtue of public safety reasons. So I'm thinking more like if there's widespread messages about false things about the COVID vaccine, if someone spreads fake news about terrorist bombing, bomb threats, I think these are the kind of cases I'm thinking of where you can say, okay, governments should step in and do something about this. But I agree with you that so far, right, the use of POFMA has been very inconsistent. And even for major things like, which you can argue maybe not locally relevant, but conspiracy theories about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, PM Lee just simply talked about cautioning people to read his messages critically, right? So if he can do that for that, I mean, why can't he do that, for many other things? And what I really thought is disappointing, and in my opinion has at least backfired for the PAP, is because it really validates your argument that it's become a political instrument to silence critics. And even veteran journalist Berta Hansen, who I do not consider an anti-PAP critic, acknowledges in a 2019 Facebook post that she also feels like the POFMA is targeted at political opponents and, really suggests some kind of preservation of self-interest on the part of the PAP. So, given that we are not likely to see a abolishment of POFMA for the time being, do you have any suggestions, at least, what changes can be made to remedy its worst abuses?
I mean, I think like the problem with laws like POFMA, and now POFMA is not alone, right? POFMA now has sister legislation like FICA and all sorts of other things, is that there are no like really effective checks and balances in them. And it grants the government so much discretion that it is very kind of prone to abuse, right? Like it's just like in my view, it's just not very safe as a legislation. Even if this government doesn't abuse it, future governments could, and all sorts of problems. So I think, it's kind of become, and it's a real pity because like even before it was passed, there were already experts who are warning that like if you want to deal with misinformation, if you want to deal with hostile information campaigns like the ones that they were citing, like Russian meddling of the elections, they were citing these sorts of examples, right? And experts were already pointing out that if that's really what you wanted to deal with, a law like POFMA is not entirely going to help you, right? Like it's so what, and we've seen that come to pass. Like now POFMA is used against like fairly small fry local voices. But if you really want to like deal with a hostile information campaign or propaganda campaign from like, I don't know, like from China or Russia or whatever, POFMA is very toothless in the face of that, because what are you going to do? Like you're going to POFMA the Chinese Communist Party, then they just ignore you, and then what are you going to do? And so like, I feel like it was really very like not value for money, this law, like we're not being protected, but now there's this law that's very like ripe for abuse. So I don't know how to change it without repealing POFMA or, like giving it such a huge overhaul that it has actual checks and balances in it. But I think like my personal view is that just throw away. But I think like that's not going to happen, right? So I think people, and I see Singaporeans kind of waking up to that, right? Like I feel like the effect of getting POFMA is very, very small these days. Like people just kind of ignore. And in a way, like if POFMA is being unjustly used to bully, then having that sort of solidarity where like people don't turn away from you because you're POFMA is something, right? And it's a double-edged sword because we see people standing by Jom, for instance, when they got POFMA, which is great. But then we also see like when POFMA is used against like vaccine denial that is based on misinformation, then it causes them to double down. And like I feel like that should have been obvious, right? Like a whole lot of the crux of vaccine denial is that the government is trying to hide something from you. Then when you POFMA them, it just validates the belief that you're trying to hide something. So I think it's really very difficult, and to kind of really deal with something like this, we need to be building a lot more like public trust, and media literacy, and that sort of having that sort of criticality to evaluate information and understand how information is being communicated to us, and to question that is really important, and it's quite hard to do, because for it to be really kind of large scale implementation, you still need the government, right, to be able to push it into the schools and everything. And so far, I think there is media literacy education, some of it, but it's very limited because, again, if your media literacy education does not come with at least some political knowledge of how politics works, then it's very kind of restricted in terms of what you can actually talk about.
We do actually have a media literacy council, right? And if I'm not wrong, it's headed by Kelvin Cheng.
I don't think he's there anymore.
Okay. But
But
I'm just wondering if you were going to go there. Like,
council is actually about media wellness. So
right.
it might be nice to people on the internet, don't troll. But that's not media literacy, yeah.
Yeah, so I think what you're asking for is really a lot more structural, a lot more transformative. The idea that people become more critical readers, and to have actually public trust in the government. Like, I think as we could see with the COVID pandemic, there is obviously some very basic level of trust, right, when it comes to majority of Singaporeans with the government. So I think we have that, but it's just that, as you said, it's a different sort, right? It's the kind of trust in the competency to deliver public services efficiently and stuff like that. But when it comes to something like POFMA, where we have to deal with interpretations and the way that we want to valorize, say, a political figure and stuff like that, like POFMA does not allow people to have alternative views and interpretations. And that is the problem in itself, because it's not a hard truth issue, it's more of a truth with a small t issue, right? And people are not allowed basically to kind of talk about that. So in that case, right, I also want to go through another part of the book where you start to talk about it's the essay where it's titled "We Are What We Remember," and you take the reader through your experience of learning about the ugly aspects of Singapore's history, Operation Spectrum, and you've done this great job of meeting all the various people, which includes volunteers, lawyers, social workers who were detained without trial for many years, right? Because they were presumed to be engaged in a Marxist conspiracy to overthrow the state. And it's definitely worth mentioning that we shouldn't accept these claims because there is no real concrete evidence except the so-called self-confessions. So in any case, it's become a lot more free and possible to discuss these old traumas. And yet, what I found very curious about your takeaway is when you went to talk to some of these members of the old left, as you put it, you found it like a challenge for them to talk about it publicly, because some of them said like there wasn't anything interesting to say, it was all a long time ago. You also wrote very movingly about one of them, Chew King Chuan, Casey, who still lives with the trauma of being in prison with his fear of not shutting the windows before going to bed at night. And so what I want to ask you is, when you look at all this, right, this idea that they still want to be silent despite after all these years, right? Maybe it's not just a byproduct of not wanting to relieve their old wounds and trauma, but is it also an indication that perhaps for the old left, they don't feel like the current generation has an interest to hear what they have to say, and so they don't think what they have to say, that kind of information is going to move most Singaporeans?
Yeah, I think there's that. I think there's definitely this sense that like, oh, this is all like such a long time ago, and like people are always looking forward, and so what is there? And some of the old left themselves might be a little bit like that, right? Like they're like, okay, I am happy to have reunion lunches with my friends, but like why would we harp on this for so long after such a long time has passed? So there is, even among the old left, a difference in opinion about how they should handle this and talk about this, or talk about it at all. And I think for a lot of people also, it's just traumatic, and it's just a lot of sort of trauma that they have had to deal with for a long time in whatever ways that they could. And to ask them to speak about it openly is unearthing a lot of things that they might not want to unearth. So yeah, so like I'm very grateful for those who are very generous about sharing, but it's completely understandable for others who don't, right? And sometimes it's also because they've maybe shared a very limited amount with their own families, and so to speak publicly, you know, might be digging up things that they might not even have shared with their own family. So yeah, I think there's a lot there that has been unaddressed, and I think there are probably a lot of stories that might never really get told because, you know, it's not for us to tell, but also the people who went through that might never quite be ready to talk about it so openly.
Yeah, it's a bit sad to have to hear that, you know, this kind of experiences are going to get lost through the annals of time. But you know, with whatever literature that we have right now, or the various books out there that some of them have at least written, I hope that we can at least, yeah, retain that and, you know, keep that within our collective memory. And along that same note, in the same essay, right, another interesting point I want to pick up is, you know, you talk about how you were, when you met these members of the old left, you felt like, in your own words, a starstruck teenager, and you saw them as trailblazers, people to follow. But over time, you also wrote that, you know, you felt it was naive to assume all of you will be aligned on same causes and issues, and you had to learn, in your own words, to separate admiration and inspiration from blind faith and uncritical imitation. And I thought this is a really good lesson, actually. You know, also to apply to the way Singaporeans should look up Lee Kuan Yew, right? Like the same way you're talking about how the left should be careful how they valorize Lim Chin Siong. So I just have a few things to say. So for one, I do agree, like, you know, to valorize whichever historical figure, you know, it works to our disservice because, for one, if you always compare the present foe of politicians or people to the old, I think for a lot of people they'll be very severely disappointed, right? Always the standards don't look, they're not consistent anyway, right? Because someone who's, you know, being an opposition politician like the PAP was, or Lee Kuan Yew was in the 1960s, he clearly wasn't, you know, after he became prime minister and stuff like that. So things change. And then, of course, for a second thing, you know, just by the pure fact that, you know, the social milieu changes, you know, people's value changes, the kind of strategies that are deemed acceptable, you know, which kind of ties back to your notion of pragmatic resistance changes. So, you know, we always need to be looking for someone, you know, who's different and who knows how to think presently and take action on present day issues. But what I want to for you to talk about is, you know, that experience that I just mentioned, the way that you learn to decouple that blind admiration and, you know, appreciation, and talk about how, you know, we can apply this kind of lesson to also the way we look at more enigmatic to, you know, to someone like Lee Kuan Yew.
I think it should just apply all the time, right? In politics, like it's not about like picking your favorite football club and just being like super loyal to your football club. Then, you know, that's not how politics works. You're supposed to evaluate the politicians, you're supposed to evaluate the party, and you know, be very clear-eyed about this sort of decisions that you make. And I think that applies in actually that really should apply everywhere, including with your football club. And so, you know, it's so for me, for example, it was like, oh wow, you know, these people were the old student activists, you know, they were like the OG organizers in Singapore, and like, you know, they did so many things. They had like sit-ins in their school, and they went and protested, and they did so much with their trade unions. And so it was all very like amazing to me to learn. And but then to then realize that like a lot of them are also very much of that time, right? And that politics, and so then to kind of realize that like because they were always talking about democracy and self-determination and anti-colonialism in their time, then like for me it was very jarring to realize that like we did not, for example, have the same views on like Hong Kong or Taiwan, you know, and then to be like, oh, but I thought you really care about democracy and
Yeah,
anti,
that's actually very interesting. You know,
but
to
yeah,
hear that they were, yeah.
you know, Taiwan is part of China, Hong Kong shouldn't have any of these protests, the kids are just rioters, not all of them, but some of them. And to be like, oh wow, like wow, we really actually do not align on these issues. But I think it is still possible to be like, yeah, we don't align on these issues, but it doesn't now mean that we have to be like mortal enemies, right? Like, and it doesn't completely discount or erase the things that they did. So like there were things that they did as student activists that I can be inspired by and want to learn from, but it doesn't mean that I have to, imitate in all other aspects, right? Like I still have my own agency to be like, okay, that was very inspiring and I'm gonna learn from that, but I don't agree with this. And like I am not obliged to like just follow whatever they say. I'm not obliged to take orders. I'm not obliged to assume that they are always correct. And I think that is it does make things sometimes feel very conflicting. But I think there's just so much kind of a more complex way to actually just react to a very complex world and very complex people.
Do you think in time to come we will have a much more honest appraisal of Lee Kuan Yew's legacy?
I hope so. I think so. I think, there's a lot of effort to kind of have this like hagiographic sort of telling of his story, but I think it's good to have more people be a bit more skeptical. And like that's not to say that you must say like, you don't have to be like, oh, he was the devil incarnate, but it is possible to recognize that he made some good decisions and that he had some very extremely problematic views and that he did very oppressive things. And, it is possible for him to be both, key to where Singapore is today and also be like very authoritarian and having made decisions that actually hurt us as well. So I think, it would be just so much better if we could learn to be comfortable with that sort of slight messiness. Like not everything needs to fit very neatly into one linear narrative.
Yeah, I actually have this particular insight about Lee Kuan Yew. It's funny how I came across it because there's a book out there that tries to collect his quotes, from all the years that of his political career. And it's very interesting, right? If you look through the early years of his political career, he sounds so democratic. He sounded exactly like an opposition, a kind of opposition that is right now, and as you say, anti-colonial in some respects. But over the years, he's obviously become very authoritarian, anti-democratic, oppressive, right? And I think he just serves as this very interesting case study about human beings who eventually obtain power and just want to have things their way, thinking that they're always right. There's a certain hubris that comes with that kind of power and that kind of corruption, and I get it. For some people, especially the elderly generation, they may not see the wrongs because they probably felt Singapore changed so much to their benefit and stuff like that. So it's very hard for them to obviously decouple that. But I think for us, now that we are living past his death, we can kind of like be a little bit more detached from that experience and understand a lot more about the costs and sacrifices of his rule.
Yeah, and I feel like moving forward, we don't always have to, while acknowledging that he was a big part of Singapore, we don't need to put such huge emphasis on him alone, right? Like, that's why I feel like I don't like this term of calling him a founding father as if without him we would have just all been somehow lost. As if Singaporeans could not have found our way without him. And we would have all like, I don't know, died poor or something. Like I don't think so, right? I feel like that's very disrespectful of Singaporeans' agency and capability. So I feel like, we could have this more complex view of him, but there's also no need to have so much emphasis on him. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Moving forward, that would probably become the case, right? Just because there'll be more and more generations of Singaporeans for whom he is more and more removed.
So, you did mention about colonization, and I thought it's good for us to talk about that, right? Because along with your analysis of the select community on deliberate online falsehood. Of course, there was obviously that contestation about Lee Kuan Yew's legacy during that community, but at the same time, you wrote about how the PAP wanted to frame colonization as a good thing for Singapore, even though, as you also state, it overlooks the harm that's inflicted on indigenous communities, and it also perpetuates the lens of the British colony. But, not only does the PAP think of colonization in such positive terms, the Workers' Party, James Lim, he posted on social media on the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the passing, that, quote, Singapore has benefited from its colonial history. So I do think when it comes to a public discourse, we're still quite nascent. Like, there still isn't very mature understandings about the concept of colonization. Some people may confuse it with modernization or globalization. So maybe I'll leave it to you to kind of explain what exactly you mean by, colonization, and how can we scrutinize it, even if we're not of indigenous descent, and arguably, according to people like James Lim, we benefited from it. And what would the decolonized Singapore look like?
Yeah, I think that's like it's interesting, but also a very huge question, right? Because like, I think all our worldviews have been so shaped by certain things that we now treat as like unquestionable truth, right? So like this whole idea that we are organized by nation states. So somehow if I drive across the causeway, somewhere in the middle, I cross this line where something becomes Malaysia's problem and then something is Singapore's problem. And like there's this line, but and we treat that as if like, oh, that is such a fixed fact of life for us now. But it wasn't always, and actually not that long ago, it wasn't, nation states were not a thing and borders were not a thing in the same way. And so I think, what's really hard for me sometimes to try to imagine is what would a decolonized Singapore look like? What would it be like if there was no colonization anywhere? And how would things be? And I think in a way we will never have answers to that, right? Like it's very hard to kind of determine this sort of counterfactual, but I think it's just interesting to think about how much we assume is shaped by this sort of quite kind of capitalist, colonialist sort of structure. So like even when we say like, oh, Singapore did well out of colonization, like what do we actually mean? Like maybe what we mean is that we came out of that well to participate in a global capitalist system that was very much shaped by colonization in the first place, right? So like we came out well because now we can participate well in a sort of very global capitalist system. But is that really was there really no other way? And I think that's one thing I've always kind of imagined but never ever have the answer to. And I remember I was reading I think it was Anthony Burgess's The Malayan Trilogy. In the Malayan Trilogy, which is like a series of 3 novels, the main character, who is this British guy who has been sent to Malaya to teach in school, and he's talking to these like Malay boys, and he's saying like, no, but like wasn't colonialism good for you? Like, isn't it good that like the British came and look, we gave you shoes, before you didn't have shoes and now you have shoes? And one of the answers that like really stuck with me and was like, yeah, but we only needed shoes because you built the roads that make our feet hurt when you walk. And so like I feel like that really like the Malayan Trilogy is written as like a sort of humorous satirical sort of novel, but that really kind of prompted me to think, right, like what are some of the things that we have today that we imagine as like an unqualified good, something that's absolutely necessary, but we only think that way because it was shaped that way, right? Like the need was created, and then now we are all like, no, this is a necessity of life, and when actually life could have been so much more different. Yeah, and so like I feel like this is probably quite a very woolly answer, but yeah, I just don't know what it would be like to have that. And like I feel like that's also a big thing that was lost, right? Like what would it have been like if we didn't get so tied into this super like capitalist system where that has now developed to a point where we feel so stressed and so tired, and so constantly, desperate to keep up with some sort of idea of progress. I just find that really hard to tell. And so when they say things like colonialism was good for us, and I always kind of wonder, like, good for who exactly? And what was lost? Like, have we ever really accounted for what was lost?
Yeah, I think for me personally, the best experience I had to learn about colonization and its, negative effects was attending Alfian Syed's play, Raffles Renounce, if I got it right, Merdeka, that was that, right? Yeah, so, I mean, it's been quite some time since I attended that play, but I wrote about it, and so, I have some memories of like the way he showed indigenous culture, the way Singapore used to be, before colonized settlement. And the message I basically took away from it is that we probably wouldn't be so westernized. That's essentially, to make it really simple and easy to understand. It would be kind of like, we listen to a lot of American songs, American television shows and movies, and imagine if we didn't, immerse ourselves in that kind of culture, the kind of cultural products, and also not being, as you mentioned, being so engaged with this capitalistic drive and feeling like as if, progress is only if we make more money, create more buildings, more private property, accumulate more material resources, right? Like you would actually look at the world and life and, what is considered good and virtuous for society and for yourself differently. And, you might even also realize that a culture of slowness, of basically doing things that are not for economic growth, but for other social goods, is the more better goal to have as a society versus, this constant drive for GDP. So I think that's kind of like my takeaway. I don't know whether you feel like that.
I mean, Merdeka is such a fantastic play, and I think I really left that play feeling this sense of between the British colonial era and then the PAP kind of the sort of political narratives that we had after independence. Like I really felt like what I really took away from Merdeka was that like Singapore is so cut off from this wider region and like from the region that we're in and the wider histories that we have. Because we talk about Singapore history in this very nation state frame that simply just didn't exist not that long ago, right? And so like, when in Merdeka he tells stories about Riau, about Johor and all these things that we today would not recognize as Singapore, but that was still part of the history and story of this land that we are now very cut off from. And like even as somebody who is not like who culturally ethnically is not indigenous to this land, it still felt like that was something that was lost, and that was something that has now in a way we take for granted, but it's actually quite unnatural to be so cut off from the land and the sea and so cut off from the region that we live in. And the other thing that I took away was this question of why we choose to commemorate Singapore leaving Malaysia as the day, like the key day in which, we are who we are and we define ourselves with this story. Like yes, it is the day that we became like officially a sovereign nation state of our own. But we could have picked other days to be important as well, like the day when, Lee Kuan Yew unilaterally declared that we are now independent from the British. Like we could have picked that day. That would have been such different connotation, and that's what the play asked, right? Like why did we could have picked that day where the connotation would be of like self-determination and empowerment. But we picked this day of separation, and then we tell this story about how we were like kicked out, and then it becomes a day of fear. And then it becomes our core national narrative to be built on fear. And like, why did we do that? And I think that really like, when I saw that in the play, I was like, that was really powerful. Like, why did we pick a story to define ourselves that's entirely based on fear and this whole idea that like fear and insecurity, and like if you don't keep up the rat race, if you don't eat other people's lunches, someone is going to eat your lunch, and this sort of unrelenting like stress. And I was just like, yeah, so I came out of that play going like, why is our core narrative stress?
Yeah, that's funny, the way you put it. Incidentally, I should also say that I think there has been some recent discoveries or research about how, this whole idea that the leaving the separation of Singapore from Malaysia was not such a dramatically played out event. There was a lot of talk already behind the scenes or
Yeah,
something
it
like
was a
that.
negotiated exit, and it wasn't like we were kicked out. So that's another part of our story that has been, told in a very particular way for political reasons.
So I feel like this is a good actually segue into me now trying to ask you more personal questions. So, I feel like towards the end of your book, right, where you talk about your essays like Traitor to My Country, I feel like this is a good point for us to really talk about you on a more personal level. So I really felt that essay that I just mentioned, Traitor to My Country, is one of the most touching pieces as you recount the personal, psychological, emotional stress from being thrown and attacked online for false accusations, and the intrusive, police investigations for simply holding a vigil outside the prison, stuff like that. And I felt it quite important that you mentioned how hard it is to resist looking at this online comments, and no matter how stubborn or how courageous you strive to be, there's only so much psyche, right? So much a person's psyche can take from this kind of public vitriol and smears. And along with the other part of your book where you talk about complacency, right? How everyone has a part to play and stuff like that. I feel like more can be done to support the well-being and reputation of critics and activists when they've been viciously attacked. So I'd like to ask you on a personal level, what kind of support have you found useful and valuable, in allowing you to carry on your struggle?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, like a lot of what takes a lot of mental and emotional energy is that the whole experience is very gaslighty. So it's all aimed at making you feel like you did something wrong, right? And that, you did something terrible. And so I feel like it really does help when people affirm, that you weren't trying to hurt anyone, you didn't do anything wrong, you weren't trying to cause any harm, right? And so people saying things like, just people acknowledging that it's unfair, I did find tremendously helpful. And I think, the flip side of that harassment, right, is that there is a lot of care and kindness in Singapore. Because, when in those times when I was getting harassed, I was also getting quite a few like private messages from friends, but also from complete strangers who were just like, hey, I don't want to wade into the fight that's brewing in the comment section, but I just want to message you privately, if you see this, to say that I see what's happening and it's not fair, and I hope you're doing okay. People would like email me or DM me these things. We had like when I was with New Narrative, we had like a little co-working space that we were at that sometimes our subscribers knew, because like if they came for events, they knew that we were based there. And I remember like in the middle of all this harassment, somebody just came and like dropped off 2 giant boxes of bird's nest for us. And he just, for like just as simple as, you guys must be very stressed and not resting well. So like, I want to make sure you eat well. And people would bring food, and people, yeah. So I think there is that level as well, right? And I think in a way that was really helpful, because online harassment can be very overwhelming, but this sort of person-to-person direct kindness is also very affirming and very helpful. And like, who knows, maybe like 50% of the comments online are from like fake accounts or whatever, but the people who came and brought you food, and the people who emailed you directly and asked all these, like, you can be quite well assured that they are real people. And I think that really made a difference.
So if anyone watching this wants to support Kirsten, please send food and love letters to her, because it clearly shows that she appreciates it a lot. So in addition to that, there's also the part, in your book, where the subtitle is called "It's Not Just About Activists, but About Everyone." There's a subtitle, and you review about conversation you had with your mom, the frustrations, well, you had, when she brushed off your concerns about social justice with very Singaporean language. It's like that law, what to do, why do you have to do this, So, I think we all get that, right, with our family members when we become like more socially engaged, right? That many of our close family members, friends just see it like it's a very pointless exercise. So I thought it's really good that you wrote about that to show, we all experience that kind. We may all experience that kind of receptivity. And the other interesting thing that you also mentioned is that um, you felt back then in a very romanticized way, nothing is more important than sticking by one's principles. But over time, as you grew older, you assume more adult responsibilities. You realize that compromises exist for a real reason, and it is understandable why people are afraid of engaging in activism. So I guess my question to you is like, let's maybe talk about your mom or your family members. Have things changed? Have they become a lot more open-minded to understanding the point of your activism?
I think they are more open to like discussing politics now. We still don't talk about it a lot, but like they are more open now because it's like a conversation. And I think just generally the environment is now it's much more normalized, right? To like make certain comments about politics. And so it's just become easier. But my family has always been my parents have always very much been like well, you're an adult now, so you have to make your own decisions, and whether I agree or disagree, it's still your life, that sort of thing. And so I think that's been very helpful, that they just let me do what I want. I'm very lucky that my husband is willing to put up with a lot and has been very supportive about this. But yeah, just generally family around me have been, yeah, either they're like somewhat supportive and will help, or they're just like, well, even if I don't agree, it's kind of up to you. And like my mom is kind of like, yeah, she's not very politically engaged. She doesn't find it particularly interesting. But if I need help for stuff, then she's always like willing to help if she can. So I think that's, for me, that's kind of like, I think that's good enough. I mean, I do understand, like what I wrote in my book, right? Like at first I was very like, oh, how can she say that it's just like that and she doesn't want to get involved? And how can she say like, oh, what to do? Like I have kids to feed, right? But then now that I'm older, I see that, right? Like I see that I was able to, in a way, like I was able to have that sort of comfortable life because she prioritized us over doing other things that might be more risky. Like definitely the life that I lead now, I cannot provide the sort of life that my parents have provided for me if I had kids. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the sad thing about trying to, you don't even have to talk about, say, being a full-fledged activist in Singapore. I mean, as long as you want to take a different pathway where it's not about trying to enrich yourself and build a business and, have more money, you simply would have a much more difficult life, in terms of trying to deal with the high cost of living, in terms of like just trying to be contributing to society in terms of, justice and stuff like that. Like you just simply have to deal with this kind of compromises. And I guess the more important thing I feel for us generally as citizens is that we need to be supportive of each other in that regard. So, not even if, say, someone's not a full-fledged activist, but just simply trying to do their best to speak out on issues, door knocking, whatever, volunteer for stuff. Like we also have to be very supportive of even such small efforts. And the other thing I was thinking about also as a very good example was actually the case of Roy Nung when he tried to crowdfund, right, to pay off the outstanding legal damages in his case with Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. Like that was very powerful to me to see that even after all these years, right, people have not heard of him. Obviously, there are probably more people out there who have a very negative view about him than not. I don't personally think I agree with him even in terms of his political analysis, but I felt like what was done to him just wasn't just, just the idea that a prime minister sues a citizen for that kind of legal damages.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of Singaporeans out there who do still have this core sense of fairness, right? Like even if they're not super politically engaged, even if they don't entirely agree, there's still this sense of like, no, that's just not fair. Like you're very big beating up somebody who is much smaller than you, then that's just not fair. And so there were a lot of people who I think donated to that crowdfunding, not because they 100% agree with Roy, but it was just a way to express that, hey, this is not fair.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to mention this because I thought it was really funny. In terms of you talking about how the PAP government tries to paint you as some kind of foreign agent, or the ISD spying on you. And you were talking about how, if they were doing that, they'd be very disappointed because they'll just, see a lot of very mundane messages, cat pictures, whatever, right? And this is on me to say, okay, so it's not coming from you, but in my opinion, if anyone did a little bit of critical thinking, right, they'll realize if it was really true that the foreign agents, the government's funding you, they'd be really dumb because, as you said, right, there's not a chance for activists to try to, do any successful campaign causes or anything like that, right? As you said, you have no policy-making people, you have no control over the mainstream media, no proximity to people of any serious political influence. But I was thinking about like, why do people think that way, right? And I think the way I look at it is that it's very similar to how conspiracy theorists would think, like all the scientists around the world are misleading people about climate science or the climate crisis. Or you have, certain right-wing pundits who think that they are Marxist professors that are infiltrating the university school system and indoctrinating students, right? So, in that sense, I feel like it's that kind of conspiratorial mindset, like as if it's a projection of some sort, right? Because as you mentioned, foreign funding or certain activities or agents are real, but it's just the way it operates is so different from the way this kind of politicians think. But where I want to turn to now, right, is to much more recent events. So a little bit outside of your book, because I want to have your commentary and thoughts. So given this whole recent spate of controversies, right, involving the PAP ministers from Tan Chuan Jin as well run, do you sense there's an appetite for more interest in accountability and monitoring of those in power? And, I want to ask you how you think we can work towards that, aside from just simply voting in more opposition political figures into parliament.
Yeah, I think, that appetite has been growing for a while, right? Like, I think that's why in the 2020 general election, when Jamus Lim was like, you don't give them a blank check, that whole idea of a blank check resonates, because I think even among people who generally support the PAP, there are people who are seeing that, it's, even if I support the ruling party, it's good to have a check on them. It's good to have someone who will argue with them in parliament and make them fight a bit harder for their beliefs and their policies. It's good to have them be tested more often. And I think so, yeah, as you said, like voting more is one way, but I think between elections, like that's key also for the accountability for Singaporeans not to act as if our political agency is only limited to elections. But we have political agency all the time, right? So there should be more kind of demands for accountability at all times, and not just, oh, let's just wait till election and then vote this way or that way. There should be more like demands, coming together to make our voices heard in different ways. And that's where like activists have been trying hard for a long time, right? To kind of bring people together for particular things, whether it's death penalty, whether it's LGBT rights, whether it's migrant workers or labor protections, just to really use our voices a lot more, because even between elections, they are still very conscious of public perception and public opinion and how people feel about the policies, right? So to kind of recognize that we do have that sort of power still, and even though, there's a lot of restrictions in Singapore, we try to occupy as much space as we have and use that to demand for more space. I think that's one way to do it.
Yeah, I want to ask you also along with that, do you think there is sufficient outrage at the comments of the ex-speaker Tan Chuan Jin, who uttered under his breath, fucking populace, in response to James Lim's speech in Parliament, just simply asking for official poverty line.
I think it's very telling of a sort of seemingly prevalent attitude, right, within that elite circle. Because like when I hear that, like I'm also hearing like Vivian Balakrishnan saying, he must have gone to a lousy school. That's it's the same mode of thinking that comes from having spent a long time very comfortable in an elite circle where you are told constantly that you are the smartest and the best and the most deserving, and you deserve this big high position that you're in, like to borrow Lee Hsien Loong's words, that you are the natural aristocracy. And I think that creates that mindset, right, that you are smarter and you are better, and that colors in the end, if you're too comfortable in it, that colors all the interactions you have with people, where people are talking to you, and instead of really engaging with the substance of what they're saying, it's about proving that you are smarter and better and more powerful, and just like, haha, other people are not as smart as me, that sort of arrogance. And I think that's very insulting to Singaporeans, so like the comments in and of themselves might not have been huge, problems, but the mindset that it's signaling, I think that's where the huge problem is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, for me, I do hope that, as you said, Singaporeans will sort of take this issue and, bring it over to voting behavior, because, I feel like we have to make kind of a stand, right? Like, do we want an elitist society or one that's a lot more egalitarian? And I think that's one that Singaporeans kind of have to decide and, ask themselves so hard questions about the level of inequality, class and privilege that the elite has, and how it really seriously adversely hampers your life, not just in terms of just maybe the wages that you receive, but even in terms of like the kind of lifestyle you can have and life choices. Like a very simple example I like to bring up is always when there was a bill tabled at Parliament just to have no emails that are sent after working hours, which is a policy that actually France has. Like, it was very quickly shot down. And to me, it was like, well, you didn't even give people a chance to decide whether they wanted this, So I think I wish Singaporeans will be a lot more aware and realize the power they have and exercise more of that, right? To make decisions for themselves as to what kind of society you want to be in. Yeah.
And there was also that whole debate just this past week, right, about what is a basic need, because they were
Exactly.
minimum income standards research, and it's just like, I mean, why are we quibbling over like what is a basic need when there are so many people who have so much, including the MP who's trying to say that, this is not really a basic need. Like, why is our bar so low? Because basically the distinction was that the minimum income standards research is not trying to determine a poverty line. And it's not trying to determine a line below which you would be completely destitute. They're trying to figure out what is your basic need to be able to actually live a full and flourishing life. And so there are budget items for like holidays to Malaysia, or, buy a bit of jewelry now and then, have some perfume that you can spray, these little things. And essentially the MP was saying that perfume and holidays are not basic needs, because his standard is you just shouldn't starve to death and you should have a roof over your head, and that's basic. But why is our bar so low? Like, why are we not aiming for people to have flourishing lives? Why is the bar to don't starve to death? And like like what made me really angry is that like he's talking like this, right? And he's like, oh, this is not a basic need. And it's so clear that his idea of basic needs is not starving to death. But I know that there are Singaporeans who are food insecure. There are Singaporeans where like when I visit them, they don't have money for food. And that's just like ridiculous. Like, Singapore is so proud and like attracting tourists on the basis that we are all food obsessed people. And we have people who cannot afford food, and like So even when our bar is already super low, we have people who still cannot meet that bar, and I think that's really horrific to me. Like, why are we not aiming for something better?
Yeah, when years ago I was working in the Ministry of Community Development, Youth and Sports, I wasn't a social worker, but I had colleagues that were, and they would share these horrible stories about people who were so poor that one anecdote strikes out to me, something like they would buy a packet of twisties and they would share that among themselves because it's like the cheapest thing they can buy to share across, a family of 3 or 5 or whatever. So yeah, so these stories do exist, and going back to what you said, yeah, I'm just as outraged to see the way the PAP is responding to, what is, you can kind of debate around the terms. Is it basic? Is it not basic? But essentially, are you really going to tell people that you should work so hard and earn so little that you can't even go on a holiday? I mean, or can't even afford perfume? I mean, that's really outrageous of a statement to make. So yeah, so I don't really know whether they appreciate the ramifications of what they're saying, right? I have kind of like 2 last questions for you. So the last one will be really fun. But before I get to that, the second last question actually is kind of like, one of those things that in Singapore we talk a lot about, right? About political divide and making sure that, politics doesn't get divisive and combative and blah, blah. So, I think it's one thing for a reader who's sympathetic to your cause, to read your book and, to gain a much deeper perspective and appreciation of your work. But if it's someone else, another reader who's very opposed, to your cause and to what you do, to read your book, right? And what I want to ask you, let's put aside maybe the PAP trolls and politicians, not having any high expectations for them. But what have your experiences been like in engaging with people who are on the opposite end of the political spectrum or who just don't see common cause with you, right? And do you think there's potential in bridging, that kind of gap? Or do you think, and this is my view, all right, this is me putting out there may be only so much that can be done, right, through civil discussions and engagement, and really more realistically, to go back to something we talked about earlier, right? Maybe if we want to build towards a much more mature democracy with a less paternalistic governmentality, we may have to accept that some of these differences are intractable, and kind of like be comfortable with accepting some degree of veracity and liveliness in our political landscape.
Yeah, I think there will always be people who don't agree, right? And who don't like what I say. And I think that's fine, that they take I hope that like the views that they take are informed. Like when I meet people who are pro death penalty, right? I'm like, at the very least, you should know who is being executed in the name of this policy that you so support. You don't come and tell me that you are pro death penalty, and then when I ask you about the death penalty, you're like, actually, I don't know, I don't care, right? Like, if you want to take a position, that position should be informed. So I hope that's the case. But I will, of course, there will always be disagreement, and I think that's part of it, right? Like, and that's fine. So I haven't really heard from people who are like more on the opposite end about whether they read my book or not. But I have heard from a few people who have said that like before reading the book, they were not involved in civil society, don't know much about civil society, didn't really follow. And they felt that it was, quite like an illuminating read and kind of gave them a lot to think about in that way. So I think that's great, right? Like it would be nice if they like started getting more active, but to at least acknowledge that there are all these different parts of Singapore and to have this sort of deeper thinking about this place that we live in. I think that's really very good.
So I've seen one incident where people of 2 different political ends of the spectrum can kind of get together. It was actually like the meeting of conservative pundit Calvin Cheng, who actually used to lambast critics like Sudhir Vedakev as being unpatriotic and traitors. But after they had a one-to-one meeting in 2020, his tone changed significantly. And he acknowledged that, to quote him, people with different political beliefs can be friends, the same kind of love for the country. So incidentally, for anyone who's curious about this, the two of them found out that they actually agree on certain issues, or like repeal of 377A, repeal of the death penalty, and the need to improve the social status of blue-collar workers. So it's, it's interesting if you just sort of like get together with people and talk to them. I think sometimes you can find more common ground than is to be expected. Yeah. Okay, so the last part of your book, and now I have a fun quiz for you. So let me first talk about what you wrote about. So in the last chapter, you kind of talk about the impact and change in mindset that you had from hearing the words of Reverend James Lawson, a veteran of the American Civil Rights Movement. Specifically, his words, so I'm going to quote them here. "We must learn to work and struggle, not for simply what we see in front of us. We must work that we may be citizens of a country that have not yet appeared. How much better it would be if people like you join the struggle, so the possibility of equality, liberty, and justice can arise in ways that we can never imagine. We will be astounded." And you capitalize on those words, astounded, and acknowledge that the efforts of many different people doing amazing things and paying a disproportionate price for their efforts. And of course, you're encouraging the reader to, consider doing their part, right? However small, and stepping outside their comfort zone. So I want to bang on those words. We will be astounded. And I want you to, so I want to offer you 6 future scenarios for Singapore. Okay, so they're hypothetical, right? But they're 6 future scenarios. And I want you to give me 2 kinds of Singaporean responses, the astounded kind. So when I offer you this scenario, you can either reply me with "can lah," which means definitely it should happen, it can happen, right? Or number 2, "can meh," which means you express some skepticism whether it's possible. Now, of course, I was thinking that maybe the optimist in you will want to say everything can lah, right? But let's try to be a bit more nuanced about it. So not everything's possible, maybe, and maybe we try and limit it to maybe within the next 5 years or next decade, or within the current circumstances, or maybe in terms of the current political landscape. You kind of give your answer, right? And just feel free to also explain your answers. So, so we can have some interesting discussion about it. Okay, here's a softball one. It will be legally permissible to keep cats in public housing.
Yeah, can. I think that will happen.
Okay, so a lot of faith and a lot of confidence. This should happen, right?
Yeah. And I mean, so many people are already doing it anyway. So I feel like.
Okay, cool. Okay, second scenario. There is really a Freedom of Information Act, and i.e. we can obtain this declassified information.
In the next 5 to 10 years, right? I think can, because like sometimes something seems like it's never coming and then it suddenly does. Like how long have people been banging on about needing a live stream of Parliament? And they kept saying it was not possible, not a good idea, there'll be grandstanding, we shouldn't do it. And then suddenly one day it was like, here's your live stream of Parliament, right? So I think the Freedom of Information Act might be something along those lines. Like if we keep talking about it and if we keep pushing, it's the sort of thing that's like, they'll keep saying no, and then one day it just becomes like not politically worthwhile to resist people anymore. Then suddenly we'll have it.
Yeah, maybe it might be like, just to use very simple terms, maybe it might be a mild version, not a strong version of it, so, right? So yeah, so that's interesting. I forgot about that, about the live streaming thing. So that's a good point you brought up. Okay, cool. Let me now test you the third scenario. There is greater freedom of speech, and I'll break that down. So it will mean something like POFMA will either be curtailed or subject to more stringent criteria or controls. A second thing is there's a public disapproval of politicians suing citizens for defamation. And third, we have a more dynamic and robust media landscape with different viewpoints. Can la or can meh?
I think
you can break it down.
Yeah, I think can la for the second and third, like the more robust media and the public, because I really feel like there's starting to be more public disapproval of the lawsuits. And I feel like the media landscape, it could get better, and like it could just become this situation where like Straits Times is very buttoned down by everyone else's, and it just becomes an untenable like position. And like we just keep pushing that boundary. So I feel like that is like not easy but possible. I don't know if they would repeal or curtail POFMA. Like maybe for face-saving reasons they might just stop using it, but I don't think they would repeal it, because that would require coming out and being very publicly like we were wrong about that. Right? Yeah.
All right. Okay. Fourth one. Here's an interesting one. Singapore will have a successful K-pop style band, so let's call it SG Pop, will produce K-drama level of quality TV shows, and Singlish will become a cool global slang or creole.
I feel not that level. I don't feel like that will happen in like a very near, maybe 10 years, maybe not 5 years, but maybe 10 years. Because I feel like there needs to be such a big ecosystem for that to happen, to become like internationally big. Like, I definitely am not skeptical because I feel like we don't have talent. Like, we definitely have the talent to do it, but do we have that sort of ecosystem and funding and openness to do it? That I'm not sure. Because even this K-pop wave has been built on like decades of a more open policy for creatives, right? It wasn't like the government is like K-pop, then K-pop pop out of the ground, right? It was such a long time of developing talent and having space for artists before any of this came about. So I think for Singapore to suddenly do it, I don't think it's that possible right away.
Right, because it's about the underlying premise, right? Whether the government or people or society in general has that robust ecosystem to promote.
It needs to come with that level of openness, right? That you feel like you can experiment and express.
Okay, cool. Nice answer. Second last one, another scenario that obviously is close to your heart. Singapore abolishes the death penalty for, okay, I broke it down to two possible options. For all crimes, that's A, or B, not all crimes, but at least exclusive to drug trafficking. And I know this is going to be hard because I know you want to be optimistic.
Yeah. I think in 10 years, I think maybe in the next 5. Like, obviously I would love to say can lah, but like, definitely it's something that we have to do a lot of work on. I think if we leave it at where we are currently, it's probably going to be extremely slow, and so probably not happening in the 5 to 10 years to abolish for drug trafficking. Because the government is extremely wedded to the death penalty for drugs. Like, there are just way more people on death row for drugs than for murder. So sometimes I almost feel like it would be easier to abolish it for murder than for drugs. And
That's interesting. I didn't know about that.
like 50, there are about 50 people on death row and only 3 murder cases. Everyone else is there for drugs. You see a lot of high-profile murder cases get prosecuted not as murder, but as causing grievous bodily harm that leads to death or whatever, which is not a capital offense. So we don't have as many murder cases on death row. And the government is extremely, whenever they talk about death penalty, it's always in relation to drugs. So I find it very hard. If we keep going in the way that we are going now, I find it very hard to believe that it would be abolished anytime soon. But I think where I would try to be optimistic is that it is then on us as Singaporeans to make it happen. Yeah.
Right. Okay, cool. The last one, all right. So, in the future, there will be no longer a Lee political dynasty. The government will be comprised of a more multifaceted and diverse political spectrum of leaders, which will be absolute nightmare to the PAP. But more importantly, concurrent with that, Singapore will want to maintain this rather than a hegemonic PAP government.
Yeah, I think so. I think people already don't feel like there should be more Lees in power. I think people already don't want that. I think people already do want that more diverse leadership. Whether the PAP is able to attract that more diverse leadership, I think it's an open question. But I already see like that there is a public appetite for that, right? So I think again, it's one of the things that Singaporeans have to make happen.
Cool. Very, very nice, optimistic notes from you. I like that a lot. So, Kirsten, it's been fun and great to talk to you over such a long session. Before we end, right, like I just want to give you a chance to be able to talk about where people can reach you. I just wanted to also make a quick mention that, you know, along with the way that your book has been released, it's been going around to different book clubs. So we are filming this on the 10th, but I believe this Saturday on the 14th, there will be a session with the No Regrets Book Club, and I think you will be there, right? So to discuss that, I don't know whether I have this video up by then. I'll try my best, but I'd like you to just plug in any future appearances or ways that people can reach you, so they can send the food and the love letters, right? So yeah, so please feel free to plug in how people can reach you and have access to, you know, to you.
Yeah, so I mean, if people for people who like subscribe to my newsletter, right? When you get it, every newsletter that you get, if you just hit reply, it actually emails me. So that's the easiest way. Otherwise, like on my website, like kirstenhan.com, there's like a contact form, which is also how people like to reach me. So usually they use that. Yeah, and like sometimes I get people like reach out to me on Instagram and things like that. So there are multiple ways to get in touch with me. So I will be at the No Regrets book club this weekend. There is another book club next week, that's organized by Cape, that's also discussing my book, but I won't be there. So I think some people would actually probably prefer that, to discuss the book without the author being present. So there's that one also. And I think I don't really have more that have been organized so far, right? Like there's the possibility that we'll do more, but I don't really have other events lined up just yet. Yeah.
All right, no problem. I mean, I hope that you know, viewers will get in touch with you and, you know, have you on their social media feed so they can always know where you'll be appearing next. You know, congratulations again on the book, and I really hope it ends up in the top sellers list for weeks and months and years, right? And yeah, and you know, no matter what, right? Yeah, this is such a great accomplishment, right, to have this book out, and I really thank you again for your time.
Thank you.